My name is Roberta McIntyre. I'm the president and CEO of Fire Safe Sonoma. We are Sonoma County's countywide Fire Safe Council, and we are a private nonprofit 501c3 organization. We've been around for well over 20 years now, working in this wildland fire safety space with the fundamental goal/mission of providing education and outreach with regard to wildland fire safety throughout Sonoma County. So we've been doing this before it became so popular. And with us today is Maya Kozla and Chad Hansen, both experts in this space. And I will let them each do their own bio when we get to them. And then third is with us is Kaylin Notch. And those of you who are subscribers with Fire Safe Sonoma and know about Fire Safe Sonoma are aware of Kaylin Notch and her level of professionalism and skill set. She's just amazing what she can pull off in a webinar. So she's going to be our producer, I guess I'll say, doing a lot of the tech work behind the scenes, and she'll be handling the Q&A and most of the chat and things like that. So just a few things that I like to start out with for housekeeping items. We are recording the webinar. We will try to make it available. And then I want you guys all to just refresh where your exits are and where your fire extinguishers are. And you probably know where your bathrooms are. So we're all good there. And then Kaylin, before we go into the introductions with Maya and Chad, do you want to kind of say a few words and follow up on any housekeeping items that I missed, and maybe talk about the format for managing the Q&A and chat?
Sure. I was just going to say for the Q&A, if you have questions along the webinar, please put them in the Q&A. Once people start to ask questions, you'll see those populate. So that just helps us figure out which questions are the most burning, I guess. So yeah.
Burning, no pun intended. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Maya, and then we'll hand it off to Chad to do kind of self-introductions. Go ahead, Maya.
Oh, thank you so much, Roberta. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Kaylin. You've putting everything together and organizing it. So behind the scenes, thanks so much. I wanted to start with looking at fire safety because fires have come really close to our doors, my doors. Basically, everyone has seen, heard, smelled, and had fire visitations of various kinds. And so I went back to what I've learned to be some of the most seminal research on fire safety, which is by Jack Cohen, and I pulled together 3 films that they're all visible online. You can take a look at them, and I wanted to really carefully look at them. And actually, in the process, having seen so much of this myself and talked to folks eminent like Chad and Alexander Seifert, I still learned something new from re-examining Jack Cohen's videos, and I would urge you to do the same. Kaylin will make them all available. So what I did was I took excerpts because they're all very long, and that would not have been the space. This would not have been. I took the nuggets. I took what are these repeated themes that I'm hearing again and again. First of all, of course, we are worried about fire becoming more severe. And so, the problem is where is it becoming more severe? Is it becoming more severe at our doorstep, or is it becoming more severe out there? And regardless of that, I felt that the themes that came over and over again from Jack Cohen's films that I would like to share with you, and I actually wrote something about them. I started getting obsessed with his work. It's amazing because he, of course, if you want to keep in mind, these little snippets that you're going to see are based on tens of thousands of homes that he examined. I mean, he just actually went out in the field, said, what happened here? What happened here? Every single time in a really detail-oriented way. So just his words are based on basically over 3 decades of wisdom. So with that, I guess it's just a 4-minute set of excerpts. And Roberta, thank you so much for playing that.
Most of our perceptions are that these big wildfires are something we can't do anything about. They're overwhelming. If huge organizations can't control the wildfire, how is it that somehow I can do something to my house to keep it from burning down? It's not a matter of controlling the wildfire, it's a matter of changing those conditions of the house and its immediate surroundings. There's a lot that we can do. The great opportunity we have as homeowners is that we can do the little things around our house to keep our home from igniting. We can actually separate our house from the extreme wildfire. We don't have to rely on the control of the extreme wildfire in order to keep our house from burning down. What we found is that the high intensity flames, more than 100 feet away from the house, are largely incapable of igniting the house directly. It's not 100-foot flames, it's a pile of firebrands that would fit in the palm of our hand. Look around your house and see where the litter, the leaves and the needles have piled up. On this house, it easily could be the critical factor that leads to its total destruction. Check your eaves, walls, and foundation for cracks or openings. Clear your gutters of leaves and needles regularly. Check out the first 5 feet from your foundation, deck, patio, or porch. There should be nothing that will burn next to your walls or under your deck. Any place that you see leaves or needles piling up from where the wind blows them is where embers will go during a wildfire. Home improvement projects like screening your vents with metal mesh or replacing wooden attachments like decks or fences with non-flammable alternatives will take you a bit longer and may cost more, but will be extremely effective in increasing your home's chances of survival. When you're ready to replace your roof or your windows, cost-effective fire-resistant alternatives are a great choice. This Gable Vent, it's the most exposed kind of vent. The brands are directly impacting that vent opening. The burning brands can blow right into the attic. The remedy is simple. All we have to do is use finer mesh screen to cover the openings. But the one thing that gives us a clue that the house was of sufficient distance from the crown fire is that there is some remaining vegetation that's unconsumed. It's certainly scorched, but it's unconsumed, which gives us a bit of a clue that the house had a chance of surviving. There's a considerable amount of irrigated vegetation around the house. Also, you can see in this particular area we've got a rock berm. It's non-flammable. We've got the sidewalk all the way around. These were irrigated. When we've got wood steps and wood decking and stairs, we want to make sure that we understand that this is as much part of the house as the house itself. So what we want to make sure of is that we've got irrigated lawn or vegetation that doesn't represent fuel up next to it. They allowed sprinklers to going before the fire came down, just prior. So there was a great deal of this that was wet. This is an important point because people, if they have the water supply, in fact can put their sprinklers on, wet things down, which definitely inhibits the firebrands, the flying embers that can potentially ignite this. We've got a lot of active crown fire that's producing a lot of lofted material, burning embers that can shower down on this house and ignite multiple places around the house. With those people putting the sprinklers out, it just guaranteed that anything like this that might have been fuel ends up being wetted such that it's no longer fuel.
Thank you so much, Roberta, for playing that so smoothly. Yeah, so what I noticed over and over and over again, and he even says this several times in the films that I'm hoping you'll get a chance to spend some time with. You know, you almost learn something new every time you see them. It's not the forest. It's the 100 feet around the house. It's not the forest. It's the 100 feet around. You know, calm down. It's not going to be out there. There's nothing you can do out there. Pretty much. It's not, if it's going to be not forest, it's going to be grass, it's going to be chaparral, it's going to be something out there. But around the house, the 100 feet, it was so impressive. And those little things. So I'm going to run through some of my colleagues very kindly have agreed for me to film them. That's one of the media that I've been working with. And also one of the things I have, great things I have in common with Roberta, is that, so I've been documenting home after home, and also as an environmental inspector, I've been looking at all the homes out after the glass fire and the Walbridge fires that have remained standing. And of course, some of them have not fared as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Roberta, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Great, thank you.
Beautiful.
So, yeah, basically running through a few of the documentations I've done. So everyone see that? Basically running through a few designers for their new homes, and really there's some things that are coming out in common. So that's what I'm seeing. And they also, I'm paying very close attention to what Jack Cohen says. And so there's these correlations. It's definitely the roof, it's definitely the vents, it's definitely the small things. And a lot of these people are, as you can see, they've not only got clearance, but they have, in this case, they've got, non-flammable areas immediately surrounding the house. And again, I'm seeing, it's these non-flammable materials that are being used, and they're not necessarily more expensive, is my understanding. We can save that for Q&A. I'll be happy to tell you whatever I've heard from all these interviews I've been doing. But look at the common themes here. It's always just that little bit of separation, and the materials and the non-flammables immediately surrounding the house. Actually, this also appears in one of the Jack Cohen's videos. He shows of people who are examples. This tree might look a little close, but it's actually pretty much 20 feet set apart from the house. It's just really the angle that you're seeing here of this other house. And here's an interesting one. This is one of my, didn't want to go too close to this house because, of course, this is one of the places I was inspecting and wanted to guarantee that, this is not a recognizable thing. But I took this photo right after the glass fire. It's one of my inspection sites. You can see two homes that stayed standing. Apparently only one shed burned. And the reason for that was given to me by the homeowner, which is there was a vent that was open in that one shed, just a vent that was open. And then he saw it from later, that's where he could see that the material went in, and that's how it caught. So he has, of course, the similar ideas, and he has quite a lot of clearing around that lower house. You can see, I'm sorry that in the foreground you can see the chaparral that's burned. So it looks like, the house has some material immediately around it. It does not. It has nothing immediately around it. And then you see the one in the distance, which is also his home. He's got two homes. The same idea there. There's a lot of clearance. Everything's limbed up. And it's not like he doesn't have trees around there. And it's not like he was doing a lot of logging either. In fact, he was trying to save his trees. He was telling me, I don't want logging done here. Is this gonna work for me? And I said, it looks like it worked just fine. You have a huge, area of forest around you, but it's just what you did to the home and the surroundings. It was brilliant, and it worked. So I want to switch gears quickly and talk about the fact that, some of the tragic fires, including Paradise Fire, and of course, I've learned this from Chad. This is one of the areas that Chad Hansen has studied very carefully, is that it was actually logged beforehand. And that logging, you can see the before and after. I'm not sure that, there's a lot of money being allocated to logging right now. And the question is, should it be going into homes instead of, this is a vast majority of an amount, which Kaylin will provide a link for the breakdown of the amounts and the people who are concerned about this. But the fact is that it does not appear, in fact, Chad would be probably more conclusive about it. It doesn't seem like that logging really helped with that, that fire. So there's a rush to log, and the question is how much and where? And of course, that 100 foot, as Jack Cohen mentions, is the amount of distance, you know, that makes the most sense. Some of the logging that goes on really far away from homes is sort of interesting. There's this interesting sequence of events that happens that sort of, in my mind, teaches us a very sad lesson, which is that once the intact forests, the top left-hand corner are thinned, this is, you can see it's the same aerial because you see the same roads. Once they're thinned, in this case, Stanislaus National Forest, a rim fire came through in 2018 August, burned the whole area in high severity, and then it became a commercial clear cut after that. So the question is, how many of these are there? So I'm inviting you to look at that. Sorry, I sort of went ahead a little too fast, but because leaping ahead, a lot of that material is being used actually now to generate biomass. That's a vicious cycle, because then you're putting all this stuff into the atmosphere that's causing more exacerbating climate change, and therefore possibly linked to worse fires. So the more that gets removed, the more that gets emitted is the basic idea here too, even with lumber. I mean, obviously there has to be a certain amount of lumber because we're relying on it, but these are the things to keep in mind in the very unnecessary thinning and removals. Let me just see, I'll stop sharing here. And I went over a lot of material really fast. So I'm sure if you have any questions, we can get right back to any one of those slides during the Q&A, which we're going to save for once Chad finishes presentation. So, okay, so.
Awesome, great, Maya, thank you very much. And yeah, so our format is intended to be, we'll do the presentations and we'll take up the Q&A after. So if you have any questions for Maya, feel free to put them in the Q&A now so you don't forget about them. We've structured the length of this particular webinar such that we should have, even with the larger group that we have, 137 right now, we should still have hopefully enough time to get through most, if not all, of the questions in the Q&A. So thank you once again, Maya, for that. And I expect there's going to be a lot of questions for you downstream here in a little while. So Chad, real quick introduction, since we kind of jumped over that earlier. Tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll pop into your presentation.
Thank you, and thanks for putting this presentation on, Roberta and Kaylin. Really appreciate it, and thanks for the wonderful presentation, Maya. I'm Dr. Chad Hansen. I'm a forest and fire ecologist with the John Muir Project. I'm based in Big Bear City, California, and I do research on forest fire behavior and the influence of logging on fire behavior throughout California and the West. So I'm going to talk today. Let me share my screen. I'm going to pull up my presentation here. I'm going to reinforce some of the key points from research from Dr. Cohen and Alexandra Seifert and others, including some of my own research, about how to protect homes, and then how some of the myths that are getting in the way of protecting communities and protecting homes and saving lives. One of the key ones is what I call the wildlands fire and fuel management myth. And this is really the idea that we can stop wildfires out in the wildlands by fire suppression and by vegetation management. And there's another term we use for this. We call it from the wildlands in approach. And that's very different from the other approach, which is to focus on the homes, which we call from the home out. So I'm going to first talk about the home itself, the from the home out approach, which is really what the science is supporting and coalescing around. And what that really means is the number one thing is the home itself. Basically, fire-resistant roofing. It doesn't have to be metal. Metal's the best for sure, but a composition roof will do just fine as long as you make sure those dry pine needles and leaves are swept off the roof and the roof is clean. Rain gutter guards to prevent the dry pine needles and leaves from accumulating in those rain gutters. Ember-proof vents, that is really, really key. That's maybe the most important thing as far as home itself is to keep flames from being driven by the winds into an attic space. Basically, it's not cutting down big trees. It's not about that. It's not about removing mature trees at all. And you can have trees within 30 or even 20 feet of the home, but you need to limb up the lower limbs. Remove those lower limbs. You need to keep the ground relatively clear of twigs and pine needles and dry leaves and things like that. Keep those dry grasses cut back and down, especially in that first 30 feet. And then less so in the next 70 feet out. The important thing is that vegetation management beyond 100 feet from homes does not give homes any additional benefit of protection during wildfires. And that's research from Seifert et al. 2014, and there's other work, of course, Jack Cohen's work backs this up as well, is that that's the zone of effectiveness. It's 100 feet from homes. In fact, it's usually only 60 feet or less. 100 feet is more like if the home's on a slope. So it's not about managing vegetation in the wildlands. And so this wildlands fire and fuel management paradigm is really not only misleading, giving people this false sense of security that they can stop fires in the wildlands, but it's also diverting scarce resources and attention away from protecting homes and saving lives in communities. And I know this from personal experience. This is a house that my wife and I owned several years ago. A fire in Southern California called the Creek Fire, different fire from the Creek Fire that burned in the Sierra Nevada last year, but the same name. This fire burned in the fall of 2017. And this whole community got really, really serious about fire safety. Everyone did pruning every single year. There are trees that are within 20 feet of homes in some places, but the grasses are cut back. People have ember-proof vents and all the key fire safety measures. The Creek Fire burned within 50 or 60 feet, about 60 feet of our house, and burned within a similar distance of other houses. This picture was taken a year and a half after the Creek Fire. And you can see the whole upper part of that image is the Angeles National Forest. And so these properties were adjacent to the National Forest, and the fire burned right through within about 60 feet of homes, right in between the homes in some cases, and then just kept going. None of the homes in the neighborhood burned. And so it's just an example of how effective this can be when the work is done. Now, my colleagues and I conducted the largest scientific analysis ever conducted in the Western United States of the factors that drive fire behavior in forest ecosystems and in woodlands. And the study is Bradley et al. 2016, and I co-authored it. It was published in the journal Ecosystem. We found two key things. Number one, forest fires are driven mainly by weather and climate down to, and you cannot fight the wind with a chainsaw. The weather, once you have high fire weather, fires cannot be suppressed. And so the idea that if we spend enough billions of dollars on increasingly industrialized fire suppression equipment and giant air tankers, that's somehow going to stop fires, that is just dangerous hubris. You cannot stop fires when they're being driven by high temperatures, high winds, and low relative humidity. What you can do is protect homes. But one thing that's come up as a key exacerbating factor that's put homes at risk is the fact that part of this wildlands fire and fuel management paradigm, this myth of fire and fuel management out in the wildlands, is associated with intensive logging, both commercial thinning, removing dead trees through what they call salvage logging out in the wildlands. And it turns out what we found is logging is a key secondary factor, and it doesn't work the way most people think. In fact, the more trees that are removed from forests through logging, live and dead, the hotter and faster the fires burn, oftentimes towards community. So in fact, fewer protections that forests have from logging in lots of different studies. This is a study showing different scenarios. Sometimes thinned areas burned a little bit less intensely. Most of the time, they burn more intensely. And so it just goes to show that yes, you can always find an exception. You can always find an example where a thinned area burned at lower intensity. And certainly the Forest Service and CAL FIRE highlight those examples. But the reality is, if you look at this in an unbiased way across the landscape, you will find that most of the time, these areas are burning more intensely in fires. And it simply comes down to microclimate. A dense old forest has a cooler, moister microclimate, whereas a thinned forest has a hotter, drier, windier microclimate. And thinning also spreads highly combustible invasive grasses as well. Now, this is a picture of the creek fire. This is an area that's on the center of the image, and the right side is Southern California Edison forest lands. And the upper part of the image and the left side is National Forest on Sierra National Forest. These areas had been heavily thinned before the creek fire occurred. Live trees had been removed, dead trees had been removed. On the Edison lands, they'd been thinning and prescribed burning for 40 years, very intensively managing these forests. And these areas burn mostly at high intensity. Now, of course, you can find exceptions. Obviously, there are places that are thinned and burned at low intensity, and you can find areas of very dense, unlogged forests that burn at high intensity. It's natural to have a mix of fire intensities. But the important point is that when these thinning option, most of the time, they tend to burn more intensely, not less. And interestingly, there's a whole stack of scientific studies that have accumulated over the past 20 years, finding that denser forests with more biomass, more trees per acre, tend to burn less intensely most of the time. And this is a figure from Zalden Dunn 2018, which corresponds to that conclusion, but also citations from some other work. And it's similar to what we found in Bradley et al. You know, another one of the key components of this myth is that dead trees out in the woodlands, out in the forests, are driving extreme fire behavior. That if an area of woodland or forest has more dead trees, it will burn much more intensely. It turns out that the opposite is true. The most comprehensive research is finding that forests or woodlands with more dead trees either burn at lower intensities. And the answer, once you think about it, is really simple. Once a tree dies, the leaves or the needles and the small twigs fall and decay into soil very, very quickly. And after that, there's really not much left to carry flames. There's not much of that kindling to carry flames. And when dead trees fall and they become large down logs, they actually soak up and retain large amounts of soil moisture. So they act more like large sponges that actually interrupt and impede the flow of air over the forest floor. Certainly a portion will get consumed, but they don't do much to drive the flames. The campfire of 2018 in the northern Sierra Nevada and the role of logging in the years prior to the campfire. And she's absolutely right. The logging that happened in the years before the campfire, post-fire logging in earlier fires, mechanical and commercial thinning, both on public and private lands, that logging across several thousand acres between the point of origin of the campfire and the town of Paradise is actually what that fire burned through the fastest and most intensely of any place in that entire fire area. In fact, it burned so rapidly through those logged areas, about 3 miles per hour, which is very fast for a forest fire, that the people in the town of Paradise had very little time to evacuate. And we know what the tragic consequences of that were. 85 lives. The community was told that the logging miles away out in the wildlands would somehow save them from fire. And so they didn't do their defensible space pruning every year. They didn't put the ember-proof vents on their houses or put rain gutter guards on. They didn't take those fire-safe measures that they could have taken, and there was no support for that because the money was all going to fund logging in the wildlands. And in this upper left image, you can see this is these post-fire logged areas from the earlier fire. and the logging companies planted tree plantations, and the the campfire just burned through that very, very rapidly toward Paradise, which you can see it's over the ridge in the distance there. Whereas in that lower right image, in the foreground, it was post-fire logged and it burned more intensely. But in the bottom of the canyon there, there was no post-fire logging or logging of any type. And you have a very, very dense, mature forest that burned mostly at low intensity and a little bit of moderate. And that's really typical in these fires. In the absence of logging, even the densest forests burn mostly at low and moderate intensity in over 75 years or even over a century. They don't burn more intensely than forests that have burned more recently. In fact, in most cases, they burn less intensely because, again, a denser forest has higher canopy cover. It has more cooling shade from the forest canopy. So the forest floor and everything on the forest floor stays more moist and cooler and shadier in the fire season. And because you have more trees and a higher biomass of trees, it acts as a windbreak against the winds that drive the flames. The last thing I'll talk about briefly before we go into question and answer is the catastrophic wildfire myth. This is another one of these myths that is dangerously directing our attention and resources out into the wildlands. And oftentimes it's used to justify destructive logging projects based upon a number of misconceptions. And the danger, of course, is that not only is this harming wildlife, it's not only making climate change worse through all these logging operations, but when all these millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent in the wildlands, ostensibly to stop catastrophic wildfire so that it won't reach a community. In reality, what's happening is that the fires are often burning hotter and faster toward towns, and wildlife habitat is being damaged in the process. So one key aspect of the catastrophic wildfire myth is that the big fires are almost entirely high intensity. Well, that's not true at all. This is the Rim Fire, a 257,000 acre fire burned in 2013 in the Sierra Nevada. Those red areas are high intensity, and they actually comprise 19.9% of the fire area. Just 80% low and moderate intensity there, where the trees get scorched, but they survive and remain green for the most part. In ponderosa pine and mixed conifer forests and many other forest types was about 20 to 35% of any given fire, any given landscape. And so the majority was low and moderate, but high intensity was a significant component. Now, the reason that matters is contrary to what we have been taught for decades, we've been told that if an area of forest burns hot and the fire kills most of the trees, that area has been destroyed and wildlife habitat has been destroyed. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, trees died from either drought and native bark beetles or from wildland fire. That's some of the risk. We call it snag forest habitat. And it's really important for woodpeckers and for other cavity nesters like bluebirds. And many native insects depend on those dead trees. So it's a rich ecosystem. In fact, bird abundance and often bird diversity typically goes up where there are more dead trees, including in areas that have 100% tree mortality in those patches. Now, that doesn't mean we want all of the forest to burn that way. We don't. It's natural for them to be majority low and moderate intensity, which is what even the biggest fires are doing. But it's just important to understand that in those places where it does burn hot, even in large patches, that's actually an ecological treasure. It's not destroyed. And in fact, a component of the catastrophic wildfire myth is this idea that when these big fires happen, they sterilize the soil and nothing will grow. That's absolute mythology. I've been studying these areas for 20 years in the field, hundreds of these fires, including the biggest ones, and doing field work in the largest high intensity fire patches. I have never once found a single acre that does not naturally regenerate after a fire. This is a large high intensity fire patch in the Rim Fire at 5 years post-fire, wonderful natural regeneration of pine and fir seedlings along with shrubs. And this is 12 years post-fire in a large high-intensity fire patch in the northern Sierra Nevada. And you see this incredibly rich natural forest regeneration. So I'll leave it there, but if people want more information, they can check out my new book coming out in May called Smokescreen, and also the 2015 book that I co-authored called The Ecological Importance of Mixed Severity Fires, Nature's Phoenix.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Chad. And we've got, our Q&A queue is filling up with a lot of good questions. So with that said, I'll hand off the Q&A portion to Kaylin, and what she'll do is she'll make an assessment of the question to see who to toss it to first. And then, for example, if she says, oh, Maya, this looks like a question for you, what do you think? And then Chad, if you want to weigh in, feel free to weigh in, and I'll do the same thing. If she tosses one of you to a question that I want to speak to, I'll just jump in there with both feet and try not to mess it up for you guys. So with that said, Kaylin, you want to start running down the Q&A for us and tossing us some questions?
So I'll start with the first question. Carl asked a question early on. Carl asked, in the Occidental area, we live in a mixed conifer forest, largely consisting of redwoods, Doug fir, and pines. If at all, how would you advise thinning such an area beyond the 100-foot zone 2 perimeter from one's home?
Chad, do you want to take that?
Sure. Short answer is I would recommend not thinning it. It's thinning is not going to stop fire. It's more likely than not will increase fire intensity if a fire occurs. It certainly won't stop it from reaching the home, and you're going to cause some damage to wildlife habitat. But the main thing is focus on the home itself and focus on the defensible space within 100 feet of the home, especially the first 60 feet. And that is going to involve removing some small trees and removing lower limbs on the mature and medium-sized trees. But I wouldn't do anything beyond that 100-foot zone, because all that's going to do is really just make the fire typically move a little faster through the forest toward the house.
Chad, what about though, we read in all of our literature, and I think there's science to support this, and we ask people if they're upslope from an area, we ask that, to reduce that heat convection issue and everything else, the preheating that may occur with a fire burning upslope, we do ask them to expand that footprint out a little longer. Does that still make sense to you?
Absolutely. No, that's a really good point. Slope is really important. So, 60 feet is really the standard distance at which it's effective on in a flat area. If you have a slope, it can be more than that, and it can be up to 100 feet. But if it's a really steep slope, it can be a little bit more. And so, especially on the downslope side below the house, if it was my house and it was a really steep slope that went 150 feet down, I would probably limb up the trees down to 150 feet if it was a very steep slope on the below the house, because fires go more intensely upslope as they're traveling. So yeah, slope is actually important, and so you do want to adjust a little bit depending on that kind of slope.
Perfect. Thanks, Chad, for clarifying that, because I did notice, I think in the Q&A, there a couple of people were asking about that. Okay, Kaylin, shoot us another one.
Ron asked an interesting question. What about areas where homes are only 20 feet apart?
Yeah.
Should I try starting and then
Sure,
and then Chad, you can jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty concerned about that myself, because of course I live in an area like it, and they're building quite close together. I would just go with, making those homes as solid fire safe as possible, because they don't have that 100-foot, and not everybody's doing that. And again, I would really pay close attention to Cohen's "it's the small stuff that's going to get you." And also, some people say that he wasn't really emphasizing on sprinklers, but I found that video where he really was. And that's what I found during my inspections too, is there was actually two houses side by side. Well, it was somewhat separated, not 20 feet. They were more than 20 feet apart. And one of them burned and one of them didn't. And then that was the difference was one of them left their sprinklers on and one of them didn't do that. So, you know, it's going to make all the, I'm just seeing it case by case, really. I'm not generalizing, but yeah. Chad, what about you?
Yeah, I think there's two things to keep in mind here. You know, so for new developments, you know, putting houses that close together is dangerous because you can have structure to structure ignition, right? You know, if one house ignites because they missed one of the things on the checklist of fire safety, then once that house is burning, if it's that close to the neighbor's house, you can just get structure to structure ignition. Now, I will say there are a number of communities where houses were built, you know, 20, 30 years ago, and they're already that close. So the question is, well, what do you do there? There actually are a couple things. You know, Maya mentioned one. Exterior sprinklers can be a huge help. Now, it's a little more expensive, and if the house is not that close to the neighbor, then, you know, it may be that you don't necessarily need to go to that length. But if it was my house and I had a neighbor 20 feet away, which I don't, fortunately, but if I did, I would put on exterior sprinklers. The other thing you can do is put hardy plank siding on the house. Hardy plank is a cement composite. It's basically non-combustible. And I would put that composite on the siding of the house in case the neighbor's house ignited.
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of echo some of the comments of Maya's and Chad's and go so far as to say, please remember, you guys, that, you know, in the wildland environment, the three methods of fire mobility involve what I call the RED, R-E-D. You're looking at the radiant heat, the ember fall, and the direct flame contact. And so if you have a house that is very close to another house, keep those methods of fire mobility in mind, and you could try to figure out ways to do your risk. You know, Chad mentioned hardy plank siding. You know, you could put a concrete block wall, but at the property line instead of a wood fence. You could not park your RV in that space, or don't build that wooden hardy, you know, what do you call it? The sturdy shed, the wooden shed, you know, right up to your property line. So whatever you can do to create that distance between you and whatever potentially could be a ball of fire, the better off you're going to be. And yes, in the more urbanized areas, they historically have worked from the perspective of, we have a local fire department. If a house catches on fire, the fire department will go there and put it out. I used to be a firefighter, and I've seen it happen where sometimes we would have a house on fire in the middle, a house partly on fire to the right, and a house partly on fire to the left. So you've got three houses burning at the same time. A metropolitan fire department can usually handle that. But if that's going on and your resources are competing with the wildland fire that blew the embers into the area to start that first house on fire, you're not going to get those kind of resources. So then you end up with something that looks like a Coffey Park, you know, devastation. So once again, go back to looking at that red, you know, look at what potentially can be the radiant heat, what potentially can be ember infiltration, and what potentially can cause direct flame contact with your house. You know, you can't do your work on your neighbor's yard, but you can reduce the risk immensely on your own home.
Roberta, can I add to that just a little bit?
Mhm.
I want to talk about a little bit about Dr. Tim Inglesby, who's running Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. He's the director. And he just almost interview for interview, he'll tell me once it crosses into the home, once it crosses from the forest to the homes, it's no longer a forest fire. It becomes like a fire that's dictated by urban sort of structure features. It's just, you can't even talk about it as a wildfire anymore.
Yeah, so, you know, yeah, a good defense, you know, in terms of at a subdivision level is really community, you know, defensible space around the community, you know, bona fide 300-foot fuel breaks, green belts, things like that, you know, to prevent that conflagration that you may have when you have those densely constructed buildings constructed, you know, close together. But okay, All right, Kaylin, what's next?
There's a question from Lynn. I heard someone say recently that letting fuel remain on the ground creates methane as it decomposes, and this is actually worse for the environment than burning. What's the accurate comparison between these two methods? And I'm not sure who was best to answer that, so I'll just let you guys decide.
I think Chad could take a shot at that first.
Yeah, it's really carbon dioxide that is emitted when decay happens from woody material on the ground, but it happens very, very slowly. And the main thing to keep in mind is that when you have a down log on the ground in a woodland or a forest or a branch, twigs, all that down woody material, that contains, and also pine needles and leaves, it contains incredibly important nutrients. Things that most people don't even think about, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, certain nutrients that are essential for the forest or the woodland to maintain its productivity and to actually continue to be a forest or a woodland. And so as it decays over many years, even decades, or even centuries in the case of a large down log, those nutrients stay in the ecosystem. When that material is removed, based on this sort of fuel reduction thinking, then those nutrients are removed from the forest. Now, when you're talking about the defensible space zone within generally 60 feet around each house, can be more again on a slope. But when you're talking about that, then you have to do it, right? You're not about ecology within that zone. You're about home safety. And I'm the same way. I'm an ecologist, but within a certain distance right around my house, it's not about ecology. I'm not cutting down mature trees, but I am doing the things I need to do to keep the house safe. And so I would just say again, and I saw there was a question about shaded fuel breaks. Basically the way I look at defensible space around each home is it's basically a 60-foot radius shaded fuel break. But out in the wildlands, it's not going to do any good. It's certainly not going to stop fire, and fires will oftentimes burn faster through those areas because there's not as much of a wind buffer.
If I may add to what Chad just said, I know where that question came from. It was a very recent and unfortunate presentation given a couple of days ago, defending massive vegetation. It's a project, I think, Sonoma County wide, approved for just massive vegetation removals and very low priority or no priority given to fire safety immediately around the homes. This vegetation plan is going to be implemented very far from the homes. So I would invite everybody, please go to some of the aerials that you can see. Chad showed a few, and I had a couple from Paradise that have, just look at the aerials yourself. Look at what happens before when there's thinning. And like that same area, let's say, for example, you find a fire perimeter of your choice. Let's say you want to look at the Wallbridge fire. Let's say you want to look at the glass fire. Just go to Calistoga. Just go look at an aerial, but just choose an aerial where you look at it high severity expanse, and then work back in time to see what the logging was like. You will 9 times out of 10 find that there was a certain amount of heavy duty logging going on that increased the pace and severity of that fire. It's just happening, I want to invite you all to just go to the aerials. And also this idea about methane, methane being, like downed wood being turned into methane. I just don't even know where he got it from. That person is not, in my opinion, a scientist. And I don't think that vegetation management program really belongs in Sonoma County. We need to take all the money and help people and their homes, people at risk and their homes. That's my vote on it. Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Maya. So Kaylin, do you see anything else that give us another question?
So I'm going to combine 2 questions that are pretty related. So Joan was asking, what species of trees were studied? Was there a difference when looking at fire intensity of thin/logged forests versus thick forests? And then Alina is asking, are any of the forests in the studies presented similar to our redwoods and mixed hardwoods?
Yeah, so I'll answer that first, if that's all right with you, Maya. So there's a whole body of research that's been done on this question, and And it's similar conclusions have been found in many different forest types, not just in California, but across the West. There was a recent study in Colorado that found the same thing in ponderosa pine forests. We found it in mixed evergreen forests, including redwoods in the northwestern California, and we found it in mixed conifer forests in the Sierra Nevada. Similar findings in eucalyptus forests in southeastern Australia, in woodlands in Portugal, in forests all over the world, we're finding similar things. And so this seems to be an intrinsic property. It's more about physics of combustion and weather than it is about the tree species. It's really about how combustion works in a wildland fire. And if you have a lot more vegetation, you're going to have a cooler, moister, and less windy microclimate, basically no matter what. Now, having said that, there are certain forest types that tend to be a little bit higher on the spectrum of high intensity, and some that tend to be a little lower on the spectrum. It typically is more related to region and the climate in that region. So for example, boreal forests up in Canada, when they burn, they tend to burn really hot when fires occur. Whereas fires in mixed conifer or ponderosa pine forests in California, they have a component that burns hot, but it's 70 or 80% low and moderate intensity. So, fire regimes do vary by forest type, but there seems to be a broad unifying principle that if you reduce the density of the forest and you open up the canopy, the fire will typically spread a little faster and oftentimes more intensely through those areas. Not always, there's always variability in any given fire, of course, but on average, that's the way it tends to work.
Great, thanks, Chad. Maya, did you want to weigh in on that at all? If not, we'll go down. Take the next question.
Sure. Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to say the Southern California fires that we're seeing are a little different because of the chaparral factor. And so chaparral does tend to burn hot, but that's just the tradition of chaparral. And also my understanding from colleague Rick Halsey is that the Southern California fires have a different characteristic. They are burning hot and frequently. And unfortunately, some of those big mastication projects are turning it into cheatgrass, which burns even faster. I've actually, on the night of, I think it was October 8th, when the fire started here in Sonoma County, the 2017, I watched and tracked on video a fire rolling down a hill, and it was all grass. It was literally coming down like a river. So the grass transports the fire really fast. I was right there. So yeah, it's, just converting everything into cheatgrass doesn't help.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that. Maya's absolutely right. And if I could just add briefly to that, this is a really important point. In forests and woodlands in California, we actually have less fire now than we had historically before fire suppression. It's been inching upwards over the past 40 years. But we still have a deficit. However, in chaparral ecosystems in California, particularly in Southern California, we actually have too much fire. And it's mostly due to unplanned human ignitions in communities next to those chaparral ecosystems. And so it's actually harming chaparral. And one of the responses to that has been to try to do prescribed burns in chaparral or to do mastication projects in chaparral. But what's happening there, especially since we already have too much fire in chaparral, it's converting those areas into grasslands, typically invasive grasslands, and there's nothing that spreads fire faster or grassland.
Okay, there's a question from Jean. Jean's asking, can you please advise those of us who have forest land that burned in the LNU Lightning Complex fire, what best practices would be for our land at this point? For example, is salvage logging a good idea for the land or to help prevent future fires?
I've just seen salvage logging be one of the most tragic problems. It's not going to solve anything. And I do think, second to what Chad is saying about the cheatgrass conversion, is that, cheatgrass is going to grow back, non-native dominated grasses are going to grow back. They're highly flammable. And of course, some of the chaparral and maybe some of the little conifers are going to try to valiantly come back. It's just the problem that it's just opening up the area and you don't have the the moisture holding capacity is gone. Also, the mycorrhizal fungi, not to go too far or deeply into this, but regrowth of a forest depends on this little vigorous underground network of mycorrhizae. And once all that, heavy machinery has been thundering around the landscape, I have not seen that come back, and I've seen a lot of different salvage logging operations. So it's a bit of a tragedy. There's really, it's the assumption is that that's garbage and that's all, it's goners. So forget it. We need to take what we can. The idea of the word salvage means, oh gosh, this is destroyed. Let me salvage what I can, which is literally nothing to do with the reality is on the ground is that that's our carbon. Think about it as our carbon, the carbon that needs to be saved. It provides shading for little trees. It sort of decomposes into soil as Chad described in much more detail. And it sort of teams up with the fungi to give this like strengthened soil factor. So all of that is sort of wiped out like a slate. And the idea of cleaning up it's just not really a realistically favorable for the forest, and it's not favorable for us, not favorable for safety for sure. So there's nothing good about it.
I agree with Maya, and I would just add a couple of things. So if you have a fire-killed tree that is very close to the house and it could fall on the house, then I would recommend felling that tree away from the house. I wouldn't recommend removing it. You just fell it away from the house. Those large down logs are really not very combustible. You don't want it within 10 or 20 feet of the house, of course, but you want to make sure that a tree that could fall on the house, you want to make sure to put that on the ground and fell it away from the house. Outside of that, I would say leave it alone, celebrate it, because those areas that burned, if they're not within your defensible space zone for that particular house, then those areas, if fire killed some trees, those areas of snag forest habitat are going to be places where you're going to enjoy seeing woodpeckers and bluebirds and chipmunks using the cavities. You are going to see in forest regeneration. And so post-fire logging really just destroys that.
I wanted to add too really quickly that Chad reminded me, because of the defensible space issue, that there's a lot of roadside logging going on, a lot of utility line logging going on where I'm monitoring and inspecting. And I really understand that point. I think that's valid. Utility lines, they require that distance, and so do roadsides. So.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it's a main road, especially an evacuation route for a community, you have to fell trees there too. The only thing I would say is once the trees are felled, they're not a hazard anymore. And so leave them on the ground for carbon retention in the system and for habitat and replenishment of the soil.
So Mark says, thanks for these great presentations. Their question is, some homeowners / property owners can afford some of the more costly home hardening methods described today. What are some recommendations for communities that are less affluent? What are some actions / policies that local jurisdictions can take on this equity issue?
This is a really, really good and important question. So thank you for asking this question. It's really important. Right now, we have billions of dollars being spent doing the wrong thing on backcountry logging and vegetation removal and backcountry fire suppression. What we need to do is stop that and redirect those funds in the spirit of equity toward creating fire-safe communities, with a priority on communities that do and homeowners who do not have the financial resources to do all the work themselves. Because it's true, there are a number of affluent homeowners that can afford to do all of the fire-safe work, and it's really no skin off their nose. But there are a lot of homeowners where they need the assistance, and right now those resources are oftentimes making things worse. So I would recommend everyone, please contact your county supervisors, contact your state legislators, contact your congressperson and your US senators, and ask them to stop the logging and vegetation removal out in the wildlands and redirect those resources into creating fire safe communities for those communities and homeowners that need the financial assistance. This is I agree, this is a very important equity issue.
Yeah, and I feel the same way. It felt like part of that question was, how do we help folks that otherwise don't have the resources to get some of that work done close to the home. And, I think that Fire Safe Sonoma in particular, I'd like to see us as an organization, once, when we receive funding for projects, to try to prioritize those, of course, first on where the risk is, and then give unlimited funds towards people who otherwise can't get the work done because either they're, elderly or seniors who can't get it done, or they're economically challenged, things like that. So, I think that should be part of the prioritization wherever we can make it that way.
So Ellie's asking, how would you define a high density mature forest? Do you object to thinning that removes small diameter trees and removes ladder fuels, with the idea of allowing the larger, older trees to grow and allowing for safe, low intensity prescribed burning? Do you believe that prescribed fire is beneficial?
So I can take a crack at that first if you like. Prescribed fire does not mimic natural wildfire. Natural wildfires have a mix of intensities, whereas prescribed fire is designed to be homogeneously low intensity. I will say this, that adjacent to a community is a narrow buffer for an additional little buffer. It can actually play a role if it's done in very low fire weather, but as a community safety measure, not out in the wildlands. Again, that's just directing resources into the wrong place. That won't do anything to save a town or a home, because there's two things that are important here. Number one, if you are going to do prescribed fire, you don't need to thin first. You can just do a prescribed fire. It doesn't matter how dense the forest is. You can do it in the spring. You can even do it in early summer. And there's a stack of scientific studies, and I'd be happy to provide those references if people are interested. You can certainly do that, but it won't mimic a natural mixed intensity wildland fire that happens in the summer. Also, prescribed fires will not stop a wildland fire. An area that's burned with prescribed fire can burn again in a wildland fire driven by hot, dry, windy conditions in as little as 9 or 10 months after the prescribed fire. And there's no way we're going to burn every 6 months. I mean, there's just no practical way to do that. It would mean we'd have smoke in the air constantly. We'd have far more carbon emissions, far more smoke for communities if we were trying to burn everything that often. And so I think the answer is let fire be fire out in the wildlands from lightning strikes, and pull back our focus and resources to the homes, to the towns, and create fire safe communities.
Yeah, I personally place a high value on life safety. And so I feel like in terms of competing for resources, if I were to prioritize, I would put a higher priority on, protecting the built environment, the communities. And what goes with that is longevity of commerce and livelihood of a community, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know enough about the science to be able to say, this particular methodology for forest thinning is good, or prescribed fire is good or bad or otherwise. But I do feel like, when it comes down to my own personal intuition, I feel like it makes a lot of sense to really put a priority on protecting those communities. And we can do that with, local, community green belts, as kind of we alluded to a moment ago. Definitely, personal defensible space and structural hardening. I feel like it feels to me like in a lot of ways we're all on the same page here. We know the fires are coming. The question is how are we going to make our built environment robust enough to survive the fires that will come? And how are we going to protect the communities when they come, by getting the folks out safely and having them able to come back to something when the fire passes through? That's kind of where I think we really need to be going. So anyway, that's that's my 2 cents worth.
I wanted to add something about prescribed fire. So one of my good friends living up in the Big Sur area, she prescribed burned just the exactly pretty much how Chad described it, an area immediately around her home. She cut it and burned it. It was, in fact, interestingly enough, just a few months before the Big Sur fire that came through. And she said literally she was in her house. It was unfortunate. It was a last minute thing and they weren't given the warning on due time. And it was so fast. So they were in their house and literally watched the fire come in. And literally, she says, it parted like water, went around the house and continued. So I think that's one of the situations where, and I also come from, originally from India, and in Nagaland, a lot of the tribes, they do yearly prescribe, well, the burns are immediately around the villages. And what they do is the villages are on little ridge tops. So they do a burn that starts below the ridge top of bamboo and it's the forest lands. And they just burn, it is, as Chad is describing, low intensity fire. And they just like have it work its way up toward the village and just months before the fire season. So then again, and that's done on a yearly basis. It's very immediate, it's very localized, and it's very carefully done. So I feel like there is a role for prescribed fire there.
Yeah, and then with regard to prescribed fire, I saw a couple of things in the chat thread that wants me to ask this question, maybe to you, Chad. With historically, the United States, Native Americans, when they were here, history tells us that they did a lot of seasonal prescribed burning, if you will, prescribed burning. I think that might be the best term I could use to describe it. But they used to burn large areas, apparently, hundreds of years ago, to help manage, the livestock and the vegetation on the lands naturally. Can you kind of speak to that and compare and contrast that kind of quote unquote prescribed burning with the prescribed burning that we're trying to do today? It feels to me like the scope of that exercise was quite a bit different when Native Americans were able to do it compared to what we're able to do today, particularly with the built environment folded into the equation.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say that there's 3 different things that are quite distinct. There's Native American cultural burning, which has been going on for thousands of years. And tribes have been burning for food, for basket materials, in zones around villages for protection, kind of like Maya mentioned in India. That's been happening for thousands of years. And of course, a lot less since colonization, and even less still over the past 150 years with fire suppression and logging policies. Then there is prescribed burning, which is not for the same purposes as Native American cultural burning. It's more of it's really kind of a fire suppression tactic. The idea is if you burn with prescribed burn, you won't have a wildland fire. The problem is that's not true. Wildland fires burn through prescribed burns all the time, even just months later, oftentimes. And then, of course, you have wildland fires from lightning strikes that are mixed intensity that happen during fire season. And they're all different. The one thing I would say, and I think for me, this is the most important point, Native American cultural burning and wildland fire from lightning strikes were both much more common before fire suppression and before colonization. And I think that's really important because I've seen some messaging recently where people make the assumption that if you had more of one, you must have had less of the other, some sort of competition between cultural burning and wildland fire. And in fact, what the research shows, not only just from fire history studies, but also work from Native American scholars, is that we had a lot more burning, both cultural and wildland fire, historically. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Again, this is in forests, right? Not in chaparral. We do have too much fire in chaparral. But in forests, we had more fire historically than we do now. And I think what that means is we need more fire. We need to have, facilitate greater access for tribes for cultural burning, and remove some of the impediments to tribes to do that. And we need to allow more lightning strikes to safely burn, mix and create mixed intensity fires in the more remote forest wildlands.
Okay. Kayla, next question.
Why is it that every year Napa and Sonoma seem to burn, but Marin, which is just as heavily forested, hasn't burned? Was
That's
essentially the question.
Interesting question. I've wondered about that myself. Maya or Chad, do you have any, insight into that with your studies?
The only thing I can think of is that number 85. Apparently 85% of all fires nationwide are caused by, human ignitions.
Stuart just asked for Chad, what specific citations and evidence can you share regarding redirecting resources away from logging and towards community hardening so we may refer to them for the authorities?
Yeah, good question. So right now, there is legislation that we are proposing that has not been introduced yet at the federal level. We would like to see similar legislation at the state level, but I will tell you that that all of the policy proposals right now are heavily weighted towards logging and chaparral removal, other vegetation management in wildlands, and increased fire suppression. And at most, they pay lip service to community fire safety and home hardening and defensible space. There's one exception that I would point to, and it was a bill introduced last year by then Senator Harris, now Vice President Harris, called the Wildfire Defense Act. And the Wildfire Defense Act was all about community protection from wildfire. It had nothing to do with logging. It had defensible space pruning. It had home hardening. It had evacuation assistance. It was exactly what we need, but Congress didn't pass it. And so we're still waiting. We're trying to encourage someone else to pick up the banner there and carry that bill forward now in this new Congress.
Well, Lynn just asked the question, what are Maya and Chad's thoughts about grazing with goats and sheep as a fuel reduction method?
Yeah, and I would ask too, specific, if I can add to that, Lynn, a little bit. I would also qualify that with particularly near the built environment. I live in a gated community in Hidden Valley Lake, actually. And I was talking to a grazer recently, and I was telling her, it would be I could totally imagine grazing within our community, because we've got a gated community. We've lots of good control points where we can actually put a grazing fence around, little neighborhood by neighborhood by neighborhood, and let these guys go through, pretty much unabated, and just clean up everything for us. Anyway, what do you guys think about that? The grazing in general, but I would ask specifically close to the built environment. Maya, you want to go first?
Honestly, I have very little background with the grazing issue. So, and I don't have it even in my tradition or history. So, and I haven't seen enough studies or seen it work in the wild as much. But Chad.
That's fair. All right. How about you, Chad? Have you done much work in that space?
I haven't done work in that space, but I can tell you just my impression. I don't think it's a good idea out in the wildlands, and it's basically the same thing with regard to whether you're talking about thinning, whether it's big trees or small trees, whether it's prescribed fire, whether it's trying to use sheep or other animals, grazing animals. You oftentimes don't get the effect that you desire. Sometimes things that seem like they might reduce fire severity actually increase it, but they always take resources and focus and attention away from homes. And so I guess what I would say is, if you're talking about the defensible space zone within 100 feet of homes, I don't care whether it's pruning shears and a rake, or whether it's a few sheep that a neighbor has. whatever gets the job done to reduce the kindling like material on the ground next to the house, the grasses, the leaves, and really small diameter material in the understory. Whatever accomplishes that, I'm all for it.
Yeah, even
except not herbicides. That's not a good idea, because
right.
it just causes more invasive grasses to come in.
I suspect that most of our attendees would be opposed to herbicides as well. But also, I think that would include even prescriptive burning within those footprints as well, where you can pull it off without putting homes at risk. I think that's another tool in the toolbox. Even though it may not be the best tool way out trying to emulate nature, but certainly as a tool in the toolbox around built environment. Would that make sense, do you think, or is that like easy talk?
I agree. In fact, I can give an example of that just from last fall in my neck of the woods. We had the El Dorado fire that was burning toward us in the mountains east of Los Angeles, and we were under an evacuation warning. And there was a community that was closer to the fire, and the fire was burning down a slope toward the community. And what the fire suppression forces did, instead of in that instance at least, instead of focusing on the colorful airdrops, the retardant out in the backcountry, what they did is they waited for nightfall, and they did basically a prescribed burn right next to the homes within 100 or 200 feet, right up to the perimeter of the property boundaries. And they did some last minute defensible space, and the fire got to that. And because it had just burned literally days earlier, the fire stopped there, and it was effective. And it was in September, late September, early October. So this was PU that is an additional little buffer. It can be effective.
Fundamentally, at the end of the day, we're all interested in doing the same thing. We're trying to protect lives, we're trying to protect property, and we're trying to find the best science that helps us get there. And for folks that are in attendance, if you want to learn more, Chad, I think, would you be interested in putting your email? I think you may have already done it in the chat. If people want to reach out to you to follow up or get more information about some of the studies you're connected with, I think that would be a good thing. Same with you, Maya. If folks have any further questions, etc., that they want to, dive into or learn more, there's not a lot we can do in an hour and a half, honestly. So it feels like we've generated a lot of interest in this area. I'd like to provide opportunities for folks to follow up and learn more. All of us, would you guys be okay with that, Maya and Chad? Okay, so I'm going to end it there. Chad, thank you very much. I think you and our philosophies are like spot on. I don't know a lot about the science. The studies I've been reading recently, have me looking at what you're talking about. I'm starting to wonder if as humans we can make a significant impact on what we think nature is going to throw at us by putting some human intervention in there at a scale that's going to be effective, or if we should really kind of take a step back from some of that thinking and look at from a point of view of, okay, let's imagine for a minute that nature's going to throw these fires at us. These fires are going to come. What do we do about it with our built environment today to make sure that that's sustainable? So that's kind of where my mind is right now, trying to learn more about all of this. Well, once again, Maya, thank you so much. Chad, thank you so much. And a big thank you to all you folks out there who attended the webinar. I do appreciate it. And I'm hoping you got some takeaways from it.